Well, let's start, Martin, with this dogfights over Syria between the Russians and the United States Air Force. A little bit concerning, or is this just the sort of thing that's been going on for the last few years?
Well, it's escalated this week. The US are claiming that the Russian Air Force is not allowed on the I think it's the east bank of the Euphrates. But the Russians have never accepted that. And in actual fact, the Russians are flying air support for the SDF, which is the Kurdish-led coalition that the US has got their troops embedded with. And they're also, the Russians are claiming that when they've been trying to attack ISIS, US planes have turned up and then they've had to avoid the US planes, and therefore ISIS have been allowed to escape. I mean, the Russians have been pretty clear from the get-go that fundamentally ISIS is a creature of the Gulf states and West, and that their pretense that they're fighting ISIS is essentially a pretense. And the ISIS have been allowed to retreat through SDF lines, which means that the Americans must have coordinated that. And as even the BBC pointed out this week, thousands of jihadis were allowed to exit from Raqqa with the full support of the Western powers. The Russians are pretty unconvinced that these things are unconnected.
Okay, Russian jets left the area soon after US jets fired flares at them. What are these flares? Obviously, they're not missiles, are they?
No, I'm not quite sure of the detail of what's happened, because obviously it's fairly confused. But obviously both sides...
Well, I'll tell you what's happened. The US jets intercepted Russian planes and fired flares at them.
Yeah, well, then I believe what I read was that Russian the planes that they were firing were close support aircraft supporting ground forces, and then when a Russian fighter plane turned up, the Americans skedaddled. Both sides are on the trigger edge here. Just any incident could turn into one or the other side shooting down the planes, and then it could just turn into a general free-for-all almost immediately. And that's the world we're living in now, total brinkmanship.
So also there's going to be apparently a delay on the banning of cluster bombs. The United States have decided that cluster bombs are going to be actually okay. Is that... I mean, is there any kind of enforcement? Not surprising.
I mean, they've been using them for years pretty indiscriminately, and they're now in Trumpian mode, just saying, well, everybody knows we use them indiscriminately, so why don't we just carry on?
And so what are these? I mean,
well, they're dangerous because, I mean, you've got lots and lots of small bomblets which are designed to, spread around a large area, and then that makes a huge area of land subsequently useless to civilians. And, of course, the main casualties are often children who pick these small bomblets up. And that's why there's been attempts to ban them.
We've also had this story from last week, which we didn't cover last week, which was that UK foreign aid money has been diverted to extremists in Syria. Really embarrassing. From the 4th of December, the government suspended a foreign aid project after BBC Panorama investigation found taxpayers' cash was being diverted to extremists in Syria. The only thing I found surprising about this was that journalists like Vanessa Beeley, who were doing the groundwork on this sort of investigation and who we've been reporting for years, literally, weren't given no credit for this story breaking.
Well, it's very strange. It's the BBC and other mainstream outlets have suddenly discovered that ISIS and other extremists in Syria got their hands on loads of high-tech weaponry and former Eastern Bloc weaponry supplied by the Western powers. But anybody who's been following the story seriously, looking at various media, is absolutely sure that that's what's been going on from the get-go. And it's being presented by the BBC as if this is an accident and they didn't intend this to happen, and that's why they've now closed down the whole programme. But in actual fact, of course, they've been deliberately supplying weaponry to these groups for years, not just in Syria, also in Libya, and before that in Afghanistan. And of course the Russian General Staff, the Syrian General Staff, the Iranian General Staff, they've got their own assessment of this, and they're pretty clear what they think is going on, and they're not fooled in the slightest. But of course Western public opinion still imagines that ISIS is somehow our enemy, which of course it is, at least for public consumption. But in actual fact, most of these jihadi groups are being orchestrated by Saudi intelligence, Western intelligence agencies, and the Israelis have also allowed jihadi rebels to cross into Israeli-controlled territory in the Golan Heights and give them various sort of material and medical support. This has been going on for a very long time, and everybody needs to recognise that it's nothing new when stuff like this happens. I think what's very interesting about what's happened this week in Syria is that the Kurdish-led SDF faction has started to negotiate with the Syrians and the Russians about a deal which will allow them some kind of say in the future of Syria. And this is at the same time as they've got US Marines embedded with them, and they're basically switching sides, potentially. There are some problems with this from a Russian-Syrian point of view because the Turks are very hostile to the SDF. But I think they are quite sensible in doing that because ultimately, they're going to have to negotiate with the Syrian government, so they might as well start now.
One of the things I've been looking at this week, Martin, is how do we get to the bottom of this, do proper investigative journalism, because it's taken 4 years or so for the BBC to catch up with what one independent journalist, who happened to be the daughter of a former Syrian ambassador, Vanessa Beeley, managed to do here. And I wonder what you make of the idea of starting a new cryptocurrency to fund investigative journalism. Let's find out now from Nafeez Ahmed, and this is around about 20 minutes. I spoke to him yesterday about this. Now, Nafeez is an investigative journalist that's worked for a long time on things like, for example, he published the definitive book on the 7/7 London bombings many years ago, and he and some of his friends have decided that rather than begging from the big media empires to try and get a few pennies to put together, that they will ask the general public to invest in their investigative journalism efforts. So here's Nafeez Ahmed.
I'm Nafeez Ahmed. I'm an investigative journalist. I have an academic background in complex systems and sciences, and my journalism, I've been led to look at all sorts of issues ranging from